All right, everyone, so today we're going to be looking at the anatomy of the muscular system. So we're going to talk about the structure and the function of our muscles. And that's not just our bicep or our quadriceps that we're going to be talking about today, but we've actually got muscle elsewhere in the body. It's not just our skeletal muscle. So we'll talk about the differences between the different types of muscle that we have in our body as well. So firstly, we're going to start off with the function of muscle. And there's a few different functions, but probably the most important one is producing movement. So our skeletal muscles produce movement in terms of locomotion and manipulation. They're just fancy words for walking and moving around. The muscle within our heart pumps blood, so it produces movement via pumping the blood around our body so that we can get the oxygen that we need from the blood to our cells to produce energy. And then we have muscle in the digestive system as well through our intestines and stomach that helps to move the food down the digestive system until it gets to the end where it is waste. The second important function of muscles is maintaining posture. So our postural muscles are constantly making little adjustments to maintain posture and help us not succumb to the force of gravity and not fall over. They help keep us upright. We'll see some of the main postural muscles later on today. So which are the muscles that are important for maintaining posture and keeping us upright. The third function of muscles is stabilizing joints. So most muscles cross joints, some of them cross 2 or 3 joints. And when a muscle crosses a certain joint, it adds to that stability of the joint. And you can see in the picture here, we've got our quadricep muscles coming down to the knee joint. And we can see the patella of the knee there, that sesamoid bone. And you can see the tendons of these muscles are really wrapping around that knee joint and going to help to provide some stability there. And then the fourth and final function of muscles is generating heat. And this one might not be so obvious, but when a muscle contracts, it generates heat. And that's why when you're cold, you shiver. So shivering is like little tiny muscle contractions that help to maintain our body temperature. And that's a natural response to if it's cold outside, our body starts to drop in its body temperature. It will contract the muscles and cause that shivering in order to create or generate some heat within the body. Okay, so some characteristics of muscles. So this is best thought of as the abilities of muscles. So firstly, we have contractility, and this just means muscles contract. They shorten when stimulated. So when we send that message to the muscle to contract, it's going to shorten. Muscles also have an ability of elasticity. This means that they can recoil or resume to their resting length after stretching. So if we contract the muscle shortens, and then the muscle is able to go back to its original resting position. And then finally, extensibility, which says that muscles can stretch or extend when relaxed. So this is like when we're doing some stretching at the gym, you're stretching the muscles. The muscles are going through extensibility where they're becoming stretched via the movement that you're doing to stretch them. Another couple important characteristics are hypertrophy and atrophy. So you might have heard that term hypertrophy before in the gym. Hypertrophy training is a type of training that you do in the gym in order to grow the muscles, to make them bigger. So when you grow the muscles, the cross-sectional area of the muscle fibers increases. We have this increase of actin and myosin filaments, and we're going to talk more about those later. But the cross-sectional area increases. So notice in the picture with those circles that there's 5 dots in the middle, and let's say those dots represent our muscle cells. We're not actually gaining more muscle cells. The muscle cells are just increasing in size. And then there's atrophy, which is the opposite, so decreased cross-sectional area of the fibers. We're not losing any of those cells, but the cells are getting smaller. So one thing to note with this is that muscles respond to the demand that we place upon them. They respond to the stress placed upon them. So with hypertrophy, we're in the gym doing, resistance training in order to increase the size of our muscles. We're damaging our muscles. We're putting a lot of pressure, a lot of weight through our muscles. Those muscles are going to think, oh, I need to get bigger in order to handle this amount of weight, so they grow. So that seems quite obvious with hypertrophy. The muscle responds to the stress placed upon it. It grows bigger if you're putting it under a lot of stress in order to cope with that stress. In terms of atrophy, this is an interesting one, because if you know someone who's bedbound, maybe they've broken their leg and they're in a cast for multiple weeks or months, you'll notice that the size of their leg, or the muscles in their leg, actually get smaller, because whilst they're in that cast, they're not able to put any stress on the muscles of that leg. So therefore, the muscles of that leg will shrink. It's the same thing that happens with someone who's bedbound for a long time. If you're in hospital and you have to stay in bed for a very, very, very long time, those muscles aren't being placed under any stress. They don't need to be big anymore. So over time, they're going to get smaller and smaller. So muscles respond to the stress placed upon them. And this happens with bones as well. If you put your bones and your muscles under a lot of stress, they're going to grow bigger and stronger. If you don't put them under any stress, they're going to grow smaller and weaker. Okay, so there's 3 different types of muscle. We've of course got our skeletal muscles, which we've all heard of: bicep brachii, deltoid, pectoralis major, our hamstrings. We've also got cardiac muscle, which is the muscle surrounding the heart. It contracts and then we have a heartbeat, so it contracts to pump the blood around the heart. And then we've got smooth muscle, and the smooth muscle is that muscle that's found within the digestive system that helps to push food and waste through the digestive system. And in order to understand these 3 different types of muscle a little better, we need to know a couple of things. So we need to know structure and function. So in terms of structure, there's 2 different types of ways that a muscle can be structured. It can be striated, which is a regular arrangement of the contractile proteins. It just means like the cells are aligned, they're in lines. And you'll notice that when you look at pictures of muscles, they've all got these tiny little lines through them. Or maybe if you've seen someone who's really, really, really lean, you can almost see those lines within that muscle through their skin. And that's the striated regular arrangement of the contractile proteins of the cells. In smooth muscle, we have an irregular arrangement of contractile proteins. So they're sort of all over the place. And you can see that in the diagrams I put there as well. And then in terms of function, we've also got 2 different types of function. So muscles can either be voluntary or involuntary. A voluntary muscle is a muscle under conscious control. So all of our skeletal muscles are voluntary. It means I decide to contract them. It's not happening automatically. It's a decision in my brain. I'm sending that message down to the muscle and the muscle contracts. We can also have involuntary muscles, which is where the muscles contract under unconscious control, like our heart. I'm not having to tell my heart to beat 50 or 60 times a minute. I don't have to have that thought process. It just happens. It's not under my conscious control. So our muscles are either going to be striated or smooth, and then voluntary or involuntary. So let's go through those 3 different types of muscle and figure out which is their structure and which is their function. So skeletal muscles, they attach to bones to create movement. That's the function of skeletal muscles. Their structure, like I said before, is striated. They're in that perfect little line arrangement. And then their function is voluntary. So I'm deciding to contract all of my skeletal muscles. It's not happening with me not thinking about it. So skeletal muscles are striated and voluntary. We've then got cardiac muscle, which we said forms the walls of the heart and allows the heart to pump blood. The structure of this cardiac muscle is also striated, and you can see there, if you look at the pink muscular parts of the heart, you can see those little lines that I'm talking about through that heart. So that's the striated structure, and the function is involuntary. It's happening without me thinking about it. So this muscle is beating on its own. And then finally, we have smooth muscle. The structure is smooth. It's sort of in the name, right? So this is our only smooth structured muscle, and it's called smooth muscle. Smooth muscle forms the walls of our hollow organs. So it forms the walls of our stomach, our intestines, and our blood vessels. So our arteries and veins are all made out of this smooth muscle. And its function is to move substances through the body, whether that's blood in the arteries and veins, or food in the stomach, or waste in the intestines. They also have a very, very, very important function of maintaining blood pressure. So when our blood is rushing through our blood vessels, our arteries and veins, this is what gives us blood pressure. So the smooth muscle that surrounds these blood vessels can narrow and widen. So with vasoconstriction, these muscles narrow, and they narrow the size of that blood vessel, therefore increasing the blood pressure. If we're narrowing the blood vessel, the blood has got less place to go. It's going to put more pressure on the walls of that blood vessel. And they can also widen, and this is called vasodilation. So we can widen the hole within this blood vessel, therefore the blood's got more space to move, lowering the blood pressure. The function is involuntary, so this happens without us thinking about it. These blood vessels will narrow and widen, vasoconstrict and vasodilate without us consciously telling our body to do that. And then throughout the stomach and intestines, we've got that movement, that sort of pushing of food and waste throughout the digestive system, which we're not consciously thinking about. And that movement caused by the smooth muscle in the stomach and intestines is called peristalsis. You might have heard of that term before. Okay, so a little summary. We've got skeletal muscle. It's striated and voluntary. Cardiac muscle is striated and involuntary. And then smooth muscle is smooth and involuntary. Okay, let's talk now about the structure of skeletal muscle. So looking specifically at skeletal muscle now, we're going to put cardiac and smooth muscle to the side. So when we take one of our skeletal muscles, let's say this is one of our quadriceps, for example, because we can see that that bone in the picture is our femur. So this is probably likely to be one of our quadricep muscles that we're looking at. There's a few different layers to know about. So firstly, the muscle belly itself. And that is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called the epimysium. The epimysium provides some structural integrity and support, but its main function is to transmit the forces that we create with the muscle to the tendons and the bones that it's connecting to. So to produce the movement, the muscle's going to contract, and that epimysium will transmit that force through the tendon and to the bone that we're trying to move. On the second layer down, we have a fascicle. A fascicle is basically like a bundle of muscle fibers, which is number 3. So bundles of muscle fibers form these fascicles, and the fascicles are surrounded by something called the perimysium. And the perimysium is important because it contains blood vessels and nerves that support and supply oxygen and nutrients to the muscle cells. Finally, number 3, we have the muscle fiber surrounded by the endomysium. And this is important because in number 3, in that endomysium, we have the capillaries that help to transmit oxygen and carbon dioxide between the muscle fibers. So it sort of does the same job as the perimysium. Okay, we've got another 3 layers as well, which we can't see here. So as we get deeper and deeper into this muscle, we've got more and more layers. 4, if we could see it, we can't here, but it's going to be on the next slide, is the myofibril, surrounded by something called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then we have the sarcomere, and then we have the myofilaments, which are called actin and myosin. So let's have a closer look at 4, 5, and 6, the myofibril, the sarcomere, and the myofilaments now. Okay, so the myofibril is the contractile element of the muscle. It's composed of bundles of myofilaments. So a single myofibril, we can see here in that picture of that long rod, we can see all those little lines in there, and those are sarcomeres, which we'll look at in a second. But importantly, the myofibril, like I said, it's surrounded by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that's shown in blue, those blue tubes surrounding that myofibril. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is very important because that is where calcium is stored in the muscle, and calcium is very important for muscle contraction. So we need to have calcium in the muscle for the muscle to contract, and the calcium is stored within that sarcoplasmic reticulum that wraps around each of those myofibrils. Next, we have the sarcomere. The sarcomere is a segment of a myofibril, and you can see the structure of the sarcomere. It's always sort of shown the same with these lines overlapping each other. And these lines are the myofilaments. So the myofilaments are the smallest part of the muscle that we need to know. There's two different types of myofilaments. There's the thick myofilament, which is that pink one. It almost has like broccoli shaped heads coming off of it. These are called active heads. But the thick myofilament there, the pink one, is called myosin. And then the blue one, the thin line of blue, is called actin. And on the actin, we have a few important structures that we're going to take a look at a little bit deeper when we get to topic number 4. But on the actin, we have binding sites, we have tropomyosin, and we have troponin. And I'm not going to get too deep into that in this session. In terms of muscle contraction, there's a few different steps that occur. So the process of muscle contraction, it's controlled by our nervous system. Like I said before, our skeletal muscles are under voluntary control. So we make that decision in the brain to contract a muscle. That message is sent down through our nerves until it reaches the final nerve, which connects to the muscle, where that message is sent across and the muscle contracts. So firstly, we have nerve stimulation. So the muscle contraction begins with a nerve impulse, and it leads to calcium release. So the nerve impulse is sent down the nerve, it reaches the muscle. At the muscle, there's going to be some calcium release. So once that message is given to the muscle, that triggers the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. And then we have something called the cross-bridge formation. So with this calcium within the muscle now, the actin and myosin are going to come together, those myofilaments are going to come together and pull inwards in order to shorten the muscle. So the power stroke is this pulling inwards. The myosin heads, those little broccoli heads, are going to connect to the actin and pull them towards the center of the sarcomere to shorten the sarcomere, which leads to the muscle shortening, which is what happens when we contract the muscle. So the sarcomere shortens, the whole muscle shortens as a result, and therefore we have a muscle contraction. So there's our sarcomere. So imagine we have this cross-bridge formation where the myosin is going to attach to the actin. The power stroke is going to be the myosin actually pulling the actin in towards the center of the sarcomere, and therefore we reach number 5, which is this overall shortening of the sarcomere. And imagine that happening millions of times over within a singular muscle. You have plenty of sarcomeres within just one single muscle. They all shorten together, and then we have this big shortening of the muscle. Okay, muscle attachment. So skeletal muscles are attached to bones via tendons. So you can see in the picture here, we've got a picture of the bicep brachii, and we can see that pink muscle belly, and that's actually connected to the bone via these white lines, and that is our tendon attaching to the bone. So there's 2 important sites that we need to know for the muscle attachment. The first one is the origin. So the origin is the fixed muscle attachment site on a bone, and the insertion is the muscle attachment site on a bone that moves during contraction. So to simplify that, with our bicep brachii, the origin is up at the shoulder and the insertion is down at the radius. Now when you contract your bicep, you're bringing your forearm up towards your shoulder, right? So the origin is fixed, the shoulder's fixed, and it's the insertion that's moving towards the origin. So the insertion is always the movable part, and the origin is more so the fixed part. Let's look at that in another example. So vastus medialis. This is one of the quadricep muscles. So think about what your quadricep does in your head. Try and get an image of that. The origin of the vastus medialis is at the top of the femur. It's at the proximal end of the femur. The insertion of the vastus medialis is on the tibia. So when you contract your quadriceps, your vastus medialis being one of those, your tibia is the part of your leg that's moving, and your femur is more stable. So the origin is the fixed part, and the insertion is the movable part. Okay, so you've got a labeled picture of some of the muscles you need to know. I'm sure a few of you will already recognize some of these, like trapezius, deltoid, pectoralis major. This is the muscles on the front of the body, anterior side. And then this is muscles on the back of the body, or the posterior side. And again, you'll recognize some of the names like the tricep brachii, the gluteus maximus, the gastrocnemius, which is the name of the calf muscle. We're going to look a little bit closer now at the skeletal muscles of the upper body. So when you're looking at a picture like this, before I move on, I just want to make it clear that each side is a different level of deepness. So for example, if we take the picture on the top left-hand side of your screen, on the left-hand side, you can see the pectoralis major and the deltoid. And then imagine if I was to peel off the pectoralis major and the deltoid, that's what we'd see on the right-hand side. So you can see that there's more ribs visible on the right-hand side there, which shows that we're looking a little bit deeper. We're looking under the muscles on the left-hand side. Some people get a little bit tricked up with that. So just note, one side is more superficial, being the left, and then one side is more deep, being the right. Okay, so important muscles of the upper body. First one is the pectoralis major, the big muscle of our chest. We've got also the deltoid, which covers the top of our shoulder, and then the bicep brachii. So the bicep brachii is a very important muscle. It's the agonist, or the main muscle of elbow flexion. We've got the deltoid, which does a lot of different actions around the shoulder. It can flex the shoulder, it can abduct the shoulder, and it can extend the shoulder. And then the pectoralis major's main action is also shoulder flexion, so lifting that humerus up in front of you. On the back of the upper body, we've got the trapezius. So the trapezius is a big triangle-shaped muscle. People often think of it as just being that top part from the neck to the top of your shoulder that creates that sort of lump between your shoulder and your neck, but it actually extends quite far down as well, as you can see on this picture. You can see the back of the deltoid here as well, and then the latissimus dorsi as well. The latissimus dorsi is the main muscle of elbow extension, so bringing that arm back down to its neutral position. In this picture, I've also got the rotator cuff circled. So the rotator cuff, you don't need to know all of the different muscles of the rotator cuff within your syllabus, but just be aware of this is where the rotator cuff is. It's around the scapula and it connects to the humerus. And the rotator cuff is really important for stabilizing the shoulder and rotating the shoulder. So internal and external rotation of the shoulder joint is going to be coming from muscles of that rotator cuff. We've also got the tricep brachii here, the tricep brachii being the agonist of elbow extension. Okay, if we look at the abs, we've got the rectus abdominis, which is our six-pack basically. Sometimes people think of the six-pack as 6 individual different muscles, but it's actually all the same muscle. It's all this rectus abdominis. And you can see in this picture that there's those grey lines in between the muscle, which is what creates that six-pack look. And those grey lines are just lines of connective tissue. So they're just connective tissue that run through the muscle, but it is all the same muscle. All six of the six-pack is the same muscle. We also need to know about the external oblique, which runs along the sides of our trunk. The main function of the external oblique is lateral flexion of the trunk. So if I'm standing up and I just tilt myself to the side, tilt myself laterally, that's lateral flexion of the trunk. And the main function of rectus abdominis is flexion of the trunk. So imagine a crunch. That is flexion of the trunk as you come up in a crunch. All right, on the back, again, a little bit deeper than the trapezius and the latissimus dorsi, we have the erectus spinae. And the erectus spinae are very important muscles for posture. So I said at the start of this that we'll be going over the important muscles for posture. It's the erectus spinae that maintain our posture. So they're always contracting to keep us upright. There's actually 3 different muscles within the erectus spinae. You don't need to know as much detail, but just so you're aware, 3 muscles within the erectus spinae. They are called iliocostalis, longissimus, and spinalis. All right, so that's the upper body and trunk all done. Let's have a look at the lower body, the legs now. So, looking at the front of the leg, if we start from the top, the first thing we have is the iliopsoas. This is the agonist or the main muscle of hip flexion. If you've ever heard anyone say, I've got a tight hip flexor, what they're really saying is I've got a tight iliopsoas. And the iliopsoas is 2 different muscles which we group together. It's actually the psoas major and the iliacus, and we put those words together and then get iliopsoas. Next we've got the quadriceps. So quadriceps being at the front of our thigh. Quad, remember, is 4, so there's 4 muscles within the quadriceps. The first one running down the center of the thigh is the rectus femoris. Then we have 3 vastus muscles. So the vastus lateralis is on the lateral side of the leg or the outside of the leg. The vastus medialis is on the inside of the leg or the medial side of the leg. So they're pretty easy. The vastus medialis, people like to call it also the teardrop muscle because when you look at a diagram like this, you can only see that little teardrop shape come out over the knee. And if you've seen someone who's really ripped with really big quadriceps, you'll notice that little teardrop shape is really pronounced and it sort of hangs over their knee a bit. But it is much bigger than this. It's much bigger than just that teardrop, but that's all we can really see when we've got all the other muscles laying on top of it. And then our 4th quadricep is the vastus intermedius. And the vastus intermedius, we can't see it. It's in the middle of the vastus lateralis and the vastus medialis, but it's underneath the rectus femoris. So we can't actually see it in a diagram like this at all. It just lies straight up the middle of the thigh underneath the rectus femoris. And then the last one on the thigh that we need to talk about is the sartorius. The sartorius is often called the strap muscle because it looks like a strap running down from your coxal bone down to the medial side of the knee. It's the longest muscle in the body. And then on the back of the leg, we've got the gluteus maximus, the prime mover of hip extension. So it extends our hip outwards. And then we have the hamstring muscles, which flex our knee joint. So in the hamstrings, we've got the bicep femoris, which is most lateral. And then on the medial side, we've got the semitendinosus, which lies underneath the semimembranosus. So the semimembranosus is on top, but the bicep femoris is on the lateral side of the leg, and they all work together to flex that knee joint. So imagine you contract your hamstrings right now. That'll result in you bending that knee up, therefore flexing that knee. As we move down the leg, so we've got the lower leg area here. On the front of the lower leg, we've got the tibialis anterior. And this muscle dorsiflexes the ankle. So it lifts our toes up. So if you're sitting at your desk right now, imagine you lift your toes up towards the ceiling. It's that tibialis anterior working there. And if you do that over and over and over again, you'll start to feel a little burn in that muscle running down the front of your tibia. Then we've got the gastrocnemius, which is often referred to as the calf. The gastrocnemius actually has two parts to it. It's got like these two teardrop shapes, but they're both the gastrocnemius, and they run down into the back of our foot via that Achilles tendon. And just underneath the gastrocnemius, we've got the soleus. So it's deep there, it's underneath the gastrocnemius. The soleus also runs down via that Achilles tendon and inserts into the back of the foot. And both the gastrocnemius and the soleus are the prime movers of plantar flexion. So standing up on your tippy toes, doing a calf raise, that's working that gastrocnemius and the soleus. All right, that is all for 1.2, anatomy of the muscular system.